starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights, creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands. Here are your hosts, Sarah Odinson, Snow, Conrad, and Emily's Drinking Fate, discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
Hail to our gods and goddesses. Hail to the land Vatir. Hail to the water Vatir. Hail to our ancestors. Hail to all of our spirits of land, sea, and sky. Hail to those who come to walk with us today in Frith. Hail to the winds. May our communication be clear and helpful. Hail to all of our ancestors behind us and in front of us. May we represent you well. May we walk with you well. Yes, Duhail.
Welcome to another show, another episode of Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 134 with my good friends and co-hosts, Snow and Emily Streaking Fate. How are you all doing tonight?
I am good. I have been moving, so that happened. Lots of driving. It was tiring, but I'm good. I'm getting settled. I'm getting things set back up again. Probably going to be setting up temporary shrine spaces while I figure that out. But such is the way of life. How about you guys?
I am doing well. The technical difficulties threw me for a bit of a loop, but otherwise it's been a pretty good day. Sarenth is still recovering, and so that is probably the biggest effect on the household. Just making sure that they have the time and the space to heal. I am enjoying the weather and time outside and hoping for a little bit more rain and a little bit more cooler weather. Cloudiness and heat is not my favorite combination, but I'm very, very grateful that we have the forest so close. So, what
I'm
about you,
doing
Saren?
well. Being able to be on a divination call with Chris Ashburn today was really cool. It was my first time I was able to do that. It's always really fun to sit down and be read and also read in kind because there's things that you read for yourself and you're like, oh, la da da, I know what this means and what that means, da da da. But then you get somebody else to read for you, and sometimes they will pick out the things that you were hiding from yourself or that you really didn't want to have answers to, but you needed them. And getting kicked in the teeth by somebody else's divination set's kind of nice. And it's also nice to read for other folks in a relaxing atmosphere. So I've been enjoying that today. The time outside has been wonderful. Since my injuries to my shoulders, I haven't been able to go outside and do the lawn. And my dad was kind enough to drive his zero turn down the road to us and do the lawn for me, which was very sweet of him. And he did an extra thing today, which I thought was awesome. He took the fence out that was in front of our garden and mowed the whole thing down so that we could compost on top of it and then get that prepped maybe next year so that everything is nice and fertile and ready to go. So just doing a lot more relying on other people than I'm used to. But, when you're on the mend, you kind of don't have much of a choice. And to a certain degree, that's for me, that's this kind of the silver lining is, I'm being forced to take a break. I'm being forced to ask for more help than I normally would. And that can be challenging at times, but other times it's kind of nice to be able to just trust that other people got it. It's been very sweet and very wonderful. Everybody in the family's been stepping up, and that's been excellent.
I'm glad you are finally learning to rest, given that being hospitalized through exhaustion and dehydration didn't seem to do it for you.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
At least the hospitalization got them to use a CPAP again, which helps with their rest.
Yeah. I really besides the obvious need for rest, it's also been kind of cool to like just take things in a lot more slowly than I normally would. Working three overtimes a week, you know, it was like there was a lot of rushing around and then crashing in between and then getting up and doing as much as I could before I had to go back to work the next day. And so it's been, oh, this is what it's like not to work yourself into the dirt. Okay. This is unusual. And I'm going to be doing what I can when I do go back to try and protect that peace now that I know what it's like. Um,
It's as if moderation and balance help.
yeah, a little bit, maybe. So, without for much further ado, I did want to bring in our guest who has been kind enough to make time with us in the dead of night and on top of all the wonderful things she has going on. I really appreciate you being willing to join us tonight. Snow, would you like to do the intro?
Sure. Is trí agus seanachí as Kilchennig I Eimear Burke, is I ceannar rónacha óbád I chomá le bheith ina sicólaí banachtaí agus fáilte. And then if Emily wants to do the English one.
Eimear is a practicing druid who works as a psychologist and celebrant. As a psychologist, she liaises with and consults professionals of various disciplines, as well as being a guest lecturer on BA and MA courses in Dublin and Tanzania. Eimear is also a board member and a chairperson of the Childcare Advisory Committee of Barretstown, an international residential therapeutic recreation camp for children. As a Druid, Eimear has been a member of OBOD since 2003, being made Chosen Chief of OBOD
Christian minister. I'm an interfaith minister. I'm a Buddhist monk. I want to bring all of that and combine it. So it's up to each individual to weave the threads between their previous spiritual values with those of being a Druid. And because we're not dogmatic, we can all stand in circle for a ceremony because we share values. And that's why I think we have so many members, is that it provides a space for the individual to develop their own practice as a Druid and to weave all of those, because there are many, I suppose all spiritual paths share common values. Often it's the fundamentalist piece or the dogma is where people fall down. But a lot, when you think of harm none, forgiveness, not stealing, love for your fellow human being. I mean, I don't know if there's any spiritual path that doesn't honor those. Now, whether everybody practices them is another thing. But that, we have the law of the harvest. So what you reap, so you shall sow. Lots of spiritual paths have that notion too. So it allows the space for the individual to work through and navigate the nuances and the complexities between different spiritual paths to weave a tapestry for themselves.
I'm wondering then if you found your time in Tanzania and traveling and all these things, have they helped inform your views on Druidry here and helped in sort of have they impacted the role that you now serve in OBOD?
Well, there's so much in common. So if you're looking at Indigenous worldviews around the world, Africa, South America, Asia, honoring the four directions, the elements. We have four elements in spirit. Other worldviews might have 5, 6 elements. That's not the point. And the use of ritual and community and ancestral worship. That the principles are the same, but the colors and the textures are different. But you can recognize, so for example, our 4 directions are associated with certain elements, but in the US, the directions are associated with different elements. So it depends on where you are in the world, but we understand the principles. So like I say, the colors and the textures are different. So there's a huge amount that links us, and there's far more that unites us than separates us. So absolutely. So when I taught both in Tanzania and in that development study centre here in Ireland, I worked with the writings of a healer from Burkina Faso called Malidoma Somé. And his book hopped out again from a bookshelf, and I read it and I thought, I would love to use this, but I don't know if I can, because this might be considered I'm too biased, because it was so in keeping with my own values. And I wanted to be careful not to be projecting my values onto my students, etc. And then my external examiner one year said, can you please use some writings from Africa? I thought, yes. And then I did. So that just allowed me. So I didn't talk about Druidry. I talked about his writings because a lot of my students were African. And, but they were so in keeping. The differences, I wouldn't agree with everything, but it was like, yes, this is so akin to how I see the world. That interconnectedness with all beings. We are nature. The notion of this world is connected to the other world. We have, those who are yet to be born. We who live here, and then our ancestors who have passed, and how. When I was in Kenya, I lived in Turkana, in the north of Kenya, and the Turkana believed that you weren't dead as long as people remembered you. And while I was there, my father became ill and then he died. And one of the reassuring things for me was that as long as he was remembered and as long as we spoke about him, he was still alive. So that keeping that ancestral connection alive was really reassuring for me. And the notion that there are beings waiting to come in, and there's us, and then those who have left, and we're all one tribe. I just find that makes a lot of sense to me.
One of my favorite things about like people that I've met in OBOD is how connected to land spirits. Much time in Africa. If you had different practices while you were there, if there were spirits of the land there that you honored while you were there versus spirits that you honored when you were back home in Ireland, if you wanted to talk about that a bit.
Interesting. So, I so when I first met Shaban, my healer friend, so we would do rituals and we would engage with his ancestors. And I was initiated, Howard and I were initiated into his family group. So I had been given the names of his ancestors and I worked with them. But I also did, so then when I started Druidry, I was always there for Imbolc. But I would do our Imbolc ceremony and my friends would join me. And it seemed really strange because it was quite hot there and there was no sign, it wasn't the 1st of spring. However, I would leave my cloths out on the 31st of January and I would call on Bridget, you know, to bring her healing dew. And I would give those cloths to people and to other healers who'd accept them. So it was about bringing my own and seeing where they fit for me and allow them engage with the spirits of the place there. Likewise, when Shaban would come here, he didn't know if his ancestors would come with him. But he met the spirit of Ireland. Now, I don't know who the spirit of Ireland is, but this was his. And then we did rituals for his ancestors in my garden. So there was that kind of creating a pathway between the two lands that I think was really, really important and very, very rich. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, that definitely answered it. I appreciate hearing about the ways in which you are able to bring your practices with you and also share in acknowledging like the spirits of where you were at. I do think that organizations that are as large as OBOD are able to experiment with that more because members can go visit other members and also see how people integrate and modify things where they're currently
And we
living.
do that. We encourage that because, you know, we have so many in the US and we have people in Australia. And in 2019, Philip, my predecessor, and Stephanie, our scribe, and I went to New Zealand to a Druid gathering. And I was blown away by, so we were in Wellington and our hosts in the grove there, the Grove of the Summer Stars, there were 2 sisters there who were of Irish origin. They and their 2 sisters, so 4 sisters married Maori men. They spoke Maori and all the children were Maori. And their parents, although of Irish origin, were very involved in the local marae, the community centre of the Maori. And they wove in. So when they were so we have our 4 directions and we have gatekeepers, you know, the salmon and the hawk and the bear and the stag. They had theirs relevant to their landscape. And they were able to weave in, with permission from elders and things like that, Maori blessings and traditions in so that their Druidry was, you know, had its origins in these islands, but also had a resonance and a connection with the landscape in which they were. And that was very, very rich. And so we encourage, you know, we work with the trees and the trees of these islands. And then it's like you're in the US and you don't have a certain tree. We'll go and find one. You yourself find a tree that you resonate with. That might correspond. You're not talking about an exact match, but you need to be able to work with the trees in your landscape. Even though you're influenced by the teachings of these lands, that you need to connect with the spirit of your own place, wherever you're living. And we encourage that a lot.
Yeah, my experience of being a heathen since about 2007, 2006-ish, And recently joining the Troth has been, especially lately, a lot of the conversation has been trending toward how do we integrate our lived religion where we're at? You know, it's not enough to be like, well, we're gonna hail Thor, but what direction are we hailing him? How are we hailing him? Does it make sense for where we're living to say, call in his storms if you're in the middle of dry season?
Yeah,
Do you want him to bring the lightning? Because that's how the wildfires start.
yeah.
Please keep those away. um, Things like that. So it's really cool to hear from a lot of different perspectives across the world that not only are people bringing themselves and their ancestors together in really neat and different ways, but how do we respectfully live on the land while, you know, I mean, I'm not native to this place, but my native friends have brought me into some teachings that allow me to speak with certain of the spirits. And so how do I do that in a way that honors my heathen path, honors the ancestors that are in the land itself? I love that it's not even a grappling with thing here. Like when talking with you about OBOD and the Troth, it's not we're not grappling with this question. It's just what's the most respectful way to do it? How do we do it right? And doing it right is just what's respectful to the spirits, right? So
Just like you do, we're having a respectful conversation. I'm not a heathen, but it doesn't matter. So, I mean, we're talking, I mean, you're talking about how do you honor spirits of place and how do you bring, honor
Mhm.
Thor. I can say, how do I honor the spirits of the place where I am now and honor my own deity spirits, ancestral spirits? We're talking the same language. The names are different. The colors are different, the textures are different, but the principles are the same. It's a bit like food, you might eat Scandinavian food and Snow there likes steak and kidney pie, and I like bacon and cabbage, and God knows what Emily likes, and somebody else wants pasta. And all of it is food, and we can share in it, and then we may have preferences,
Mhm.
or we're not going to fight over it, and say, become food fascists over it. And it's all about that. And I think no matter where you are, you need to engage with the genius loci, the spirit of place. And there may be ways that, the indigenous people of the place where you are will say, this is how you do it. But there's also your own relationship, because your relationship with the spirit of place will not be the same as theirs.
Right.
It's a bit like, you join a big family, you're the guest, and they all interact with each other in a very different way to the way you do. And your relationship with that family will be unique to you, and their relationship among each other is very unique to them. And I think it's very, very important. And to do it, and I think you mentioned the word respect, and respect comes from the Latin to respectare, take a second look, not coming as somebody who's feeling guilty, because guilt is an awful motivator. You end up being defensive. And I mean, obviously we watch our behavior and we take responsibility for our actions, but to be able to stand on the ground as a visitor and acknowledging, yeah, maybe you're an outsider. Now, maybe you've been living in the land for 300 years. I have no idea. I'll tell you, so Howard and I used to go to, well, I taught every year in Tanzania for 20 years, and I have a house there. And Shaban, my healer friend, invited us to build a house on his land, and we built a wooden house, and then he and his wife separated, and he said, take the house, she'll burn it. So we moved it to another friend who had a site and no house, and we had a house and no site. We placed it there. But at one point, other friends were saying, why don't you buy some land here and build a house? And I remember Howard saying, well, we'd be outsiders. And Elias says, yes, you'll never be an insider, except you're an outsider, and we need outsiders. And there was something about the value of the outsider perspective. So when you are standing on, that has been occupied land, I don't know where you live in the US, but still you're there as a visitor. It's still your home now. And you can still honor the spirits of the place, not the way the indigenous people do, but you still need to honor them because you're there.
Yeah, it's one of the things that my my Ojibwe boyfriend kept bringing back to me was because I was very worried about cultural appropriation. He's like,
Yeah.
"Are you taking from me?" No, I'm handing you these teachings. I'm giving them to you. Like the worst thing you could do is do nothing with them, and that
Absolutely.
and that made me sit back in my ass for a bit because I was like, "Oh, okay," because this gift brings responsibility with it, right? And so, you know, I also have to be a little careful. Like, am I talking to bear in terms of Mukwa Manadu, or am I talking to bear in terms of Bjorn, the spirit of the bear, as I understand it through heathenry? Um, and so some of the language that I approach differs, some of the way that I honor them differs. I never offer alcohol to native spirits, but I offer alcohol to my heathen ones. Um, And sometimes the Lanvatir are like, no alcohol for the ceremony. Sometimes the Lanvatir are like, yeah, come on, don't be a cheapskate, bring on the vodka. Um, and I think that having to navigate that as a for myself, like coming to Michigan, my ancestors have only been here for maybe 120 years if we're lucky. One of my more recent ancestors immigrated here back at the start of World War One when they could hear the gunboats off the shore of the Netherlands. And they're like,
Mhm.
okay, that's enough. They sponsored their brother and he came over. And by the time he died, he couldn't read or write either English or Dutch. And a lot of the stories got lost along the way. So a lot of the perspective that I'm coming at this from is in some ways I'm reconnecting with the cultures of my ancestors, but I'm also utterly a modern American because of where I'm living and how. And I can't not honor the spirits of the land that I'm living on. So that discomfort's just going to have to be part of it. This is home, for better or for worse. And so far,
Absolutely. And I mean, you can have Bjorn talk to Bear. There might be far more
mhm,
in common with those two spirits. And that's where you play in a very respectful way between these two. They're both bears, but
right,
they speak a different language, but that they're still bear.
absolutely.
Finding that way, I think people now are getting so terrified of appropriation that it paralyzes you. I mean, I understand there's been so much appropriation. I live in a colonized land, so I understand it. However, you need to, at some point, recognize the difference between exploitation and engaging in a respectful way with practices, prayers, spirits, etc.
Yeah, because if I had let that fear and that concern get in the way, I'd be so much poorer for it.
That's right.
And my children would be so much poorer for it because they don't have the same kinds of hangups I do because they've grown up with this as opposed to former Roman Catholic as well. So, I've got that in my background. And so there's a bit of a learning curve, an unlearning curve too, when you're coming to a new understanding and a new religion. And that I'm glad to hear that that process is certainly not unique.
No,
But
and it's you need to. Bill Plotkin talks about this, about soul, and having soul is knowing where you belong and knowing your place in the world. And it's not about, I'm superior to you and you know your place, I'll keep you in your place. We often use that in a very derogatory term. But when you know your place, when you can find it and you can stand your 2 feet in your land and say, I belong, that's where your soul is. And so much of conflict in the world is people don't have that. They're fighting over land, stealing somebody else's, wishing they belonged, never having enough, all of that kind of stuff, which, fuels greed and war, etc., and exploitation. But to be able to stand wherever you are and say, you know what, I belong. So I live in Kilkenny. That's not where I was born. That's not where I was brought up, but I belong there. It doesn't belong to me, but I belong to it. And it's the landscape. It's not the people. It's the actual land. And to be able to stand on that land and say, yeah, I belong here. And I think that's really important and really healing. And belonging to land doesn't mean you own it necessarily. It doesn't mean that. It's about finding a place where you can stand and say, this is a woods, or this is a creek or a lake or whatever, a mountain or a rock. Do you know what? I belong here. I've made that connection. That's where my soul is. That's my take me worth.
That is absolutely how I feel about where we are. That hits. That hits so many parts of me. I appreciate you saying it in that way. This is home. This is where my soul belongs.
Mm.
I'm curious because people talk about the sort of oral traditions in Africa, and how a lot of those cultures were very sort of oral as opposed to literary. And of course, being Irish and being a Shanachie, how did you sort of, what was your experience like with the sort of storytelling and oral culture in Tanzania? And has that had any impact on your being a Shanachie and a storyteller in OBOD?
Well, it's interesting. There's a number of stories I've gotten from Africa that I've made mine. And very similar. I mean, the reason we don't know about how our ancient Druids behaved or had practiced is because it was an oral tradition, and they believed that to write was maybe a sign of weakness. You kept everything in here. And it's the same in Africa. I mean, I remember students saying that, our old people are libraries that hold all the knowledge, but of course it's not recorded, and then they die and they pass on. And so much is being lost there. Again, do you know what? There's no culture that doesn't have storytelling. And many of the stories are universal. And that's what's fascinating too. That there's a story I tell about a blind man catches a bird, and it's about peace and how people, what causes conflict and what causes resolution after a conflict. And you go, I know that. It's set in Zimbabwe, but that could be set in Kilkenny. There are so many universal truths and stories all around the world. And in 2023, was it? Yeah, I was at Marrakesh at a World Storytelling Festival, and I heard 3 versions of the same story: an Irish version, a Moroccan version, and another version. And I thought, okay, they're coming from 3 different lands, and it's the same story. The names are different, slight differences, and that it's just fascinating how there are threads of story. I mean, stories is about weaving threads, and how those threads can go all around the world, and the principles and the lessons in them, how they resonate with all of us. So I see them, they've been really, really feeding me, but there's a two-way process. And that's what, when I was growing up, there was such a shame about being Irish, and we didn't have anything of value. And then people discovered, we say New Age spiritual path, and Native America, that's where it's all at. Indians are great, and it's this, that, and the other. And, spiritual leaders from the US would come over, and people would be really impressed. And not that they weren't impressive, that's not what I'm saying. But it was like, we need to look to those people because we have nothing. And it's like, no, we have it in our own lands. Equally valuable. It's about opening up to it. Story does that, allowing us to. So when we look into our myths, we have a really rich heritage. And thanks to the Christian monks who recorded those, albeit with, through a Christian lens. But there's so much there. But because of colonialism, we were taught to negate that, which was the same, I suppose, in the US. And I suppose it's the it's the work of the colonists to deride and diminish the colonized. And we were like that. And now it's coming back, people beginning to appreciate their own culture and story. And I could see that in Africa when I started teaching the writings of Malidoma Somé. People would say, "You're telling us to honor our African things." I go, "Yeah." "Oh my God, it takes a white person to tell us this." Because they had been brought, like, everyone wants a Western education, because if you can speak English, you get a Western education, then you can go far and you can prosper, which you can. But you pay a heavy price for that if you cut off from your own roots. And that wound doesn't go away just because you've gotten a PhD and you have a job someplace in the world and you're very wealthy. There's always that wound. So my working with the teachings of Malidoma Somé and using them in Africa was really, really fascinating. I remember one guy, he'd come to Ireland and he went to his elders before he left. And they said, "Good luck with your studies and bring us back development," which is what they said to him. And he said, "And now you're talking about this guy and you're telling me I need to go back to my," I said, "Yes." "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you're telling me this. This is wonderful." That is development. So again, looking to our own history and our own stories, at the same time, recognizing that we need a modern world. I mean, if we didn't have technology, we would not be having this conversation now.
Absolutely.
It's not either or, it's both and. And it's the same with it's Bjorn and it's Bear. It's both. It's speaking English and speaking Irish Snow. Emily, it's about recognizing it's both and. The difficulty in the world today is there's so much polarization. If you don't agree with me 100%, it means you're completely contrary to me. When it's like, no, we just have slightly different way. Like Bjorn and Bear don't fight, but they don't say the same thing. And they don't stand in exactly the same position. They might be side by side or a little bit apart, but they're not enemies. And it's about weaving the both and rather than either or. And I think nature is about that weaving, that interconnectedness. And we do that in the order. It's like there's space for everybody. I like to describe the order as a salad, not a puree. So it has all kinds of leaves and nuts and seeds. And maybe you can have meat and fish or cheese, or maybe you don't like any of those. And there's different dressings and different tastes, so that you can actually, when you have the salad, you can taste and discriminate and discern the different textures and the different micro tastes. You can have fruit in there, where if it's a puree, it tends to be everything is assimilated and there's no space for individuality. And I think we need salads.
I really appreciate how you put that, because here when people say, we all need to be on the same page, that doesn't track to me, but us all being part of the same salad, that seems much more honoring where each of us is coming out of. And especially when you're talking about it's sometimes it's not even preference. It's like I know folks who have like gluten allergies where it'll drop them. Sometimes it's not even I don't want to have this, but I can't handle it. And the fact that OBOD and so many modern pagan traditions and the indigenous traditions that I've had the honor to encounter have space where it's like, this is the boundaries of this recipe. What's local to you? I was watching a video on the history of the American West, and one of the things that doesn't get talked enough about was what they were actually serving in the saloons wasn't just steak and potatoes. In a lot of those early saloons, they were serving chop suey because of the Chinese immigration that was like en masse at that point. A lot of the people who were cooking were Chinese immigrants, and some of the after the saloons would go up, some of the first places that would go up after them were Chinese restaurants, which gives you a whole different view of the West as opposed to the white dominated
Westerns in the films. It was always beans and steak and bread and grits or whatever it is and gravy, that kind of stuff. That's really interesting.
Yeah, like when we start honoring and actually looking at our history and saying, hey, this is what actually was, not what our media is telling us it was, but this is the lived experience of people. It allows this richness that I think we really often miss. Because if you think that, oh, they're just all eating steak, potatoes, and beans, it misses the real diversity. Like most of the cowboys were people of color. Either there were natives or they were natives who had mixed with black folks who had escaped slavery or were adopted into the tribes, for instance. Like most of the cowboys were people of color, some description. Yeah. So like, and most of our Western films are incredibly white.
That's right.
So I mean, like even just with the diet we're taking in of our media, if we apply some discernment, you know, that to me, that approaching it as a salad and not as a soup, or actually soup might be just as honoring, but instead of a puree, that I love how you put that. I appreciate that.
I have a friend who's from Derbyshire in England, and he has a Japanese wife, and they met when he was working over in Japan. And he was saying that the sort of trendy thing in Japan is to have a Western style wedding with someone playing the part of a Christian priest. But he grew up Catholic here and went to a Catholic school. So the way that he put it to me was he wasn't going to look some part-time English tutor in the eye and be convinced that he was a Catholic priest. So he turned around to his fiancée and said, "No, if we're doing this, I want a traditional Japanese wedding."
Wow.
Yeah. He was saying, "I'd rather do your culture properly than my culture not right."
Brilliant. Wonderful.
Yeah, so he was saying the first ever traditional Japanese wedding he went to was his own.
I love it. Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah.
But I appreciate your pointing out that a lot of the Irish sort of myths and legends and things we have were written down by the monks. And I sort of think the sort of more modern sort of parallel we've got there are things like Dúchas Puncaí, the Irish folklore commission that in the 20s, where the government, for those who don't know, the Irish government going around all the different regions in Ireland and making notes of different regional tales and stories and things. I don't know, Eimear, if you found that has sort of impacted your views or practices or OBOD or anything.
Absolutely. So you will have myths and stories in the manuscripts, and then you have folklore, which is very, very different in many ways. So, for example, I was leading myself and a friend, Sean O'Guihin, who's also a member of the order. We led a retreat last weekend in Donegal, and it was based on Bearog. So we have the Second Battle of Moytura, which is a big epic story in the mythology, and there are many, many strands and different aspects to it. But essentially, it's about how Lugh of the long hand, the many skilled one, saved the Tuatha Dé Danann from the evils of Balor, his grandfather, who had one eye and was an evil eye, who was demanding tribute every year from the Tuatha Dé Danann for years and years and years. And in the story with the manuscripts, they mention two mentions of a little Druid woman called Bearog. You don't know anything else about her. She flew Cian over, who met Ethna. They held hands all night, and then 9 months later she got pregnant. And Balor gave birth to 3 boys, and Balor threw them into the sea, and the first 2 fell into the sea, and Bearog saved the third one, and that was Lugh. So Bearog ensured that Lugh was conceived and then saved his life. That ensured that the whole prophecy was fulfilled. So I tell the story from her. I animate, because I tell stories from the perspective or the voice of characters that are important but don't get any other mention, and usually they're women. But this story, we held the retreat in the land where the folklore says the story took place. So Moitura is in Sligo, but this is Donegal. And then Tory Island is where Balor had his stronghold. And it was really, really interesting because we were talking about, this is what the manuscript says, this is what the folklore says. And then there will be, you'll have one legend that we all know that's in a manuscript, but then there'll be different places around the country that say, this is where it took place. So folklore is, again, because folklore is organic. Things change with time. So when the nuns wrote, or then the monks wrote down the stories, they would have obviously listened to the stories of the people at the time. And then the folklore from the, recorded by the Folklore Commission in the 30s, that's something that happened, 1500 years later. And it's just fascinating. Again, it's rich because being able to stand in a landscape in which a story takes place, there's a magic there. So it's just beautiful.
I have a question, and it's something that I encounter sometimes when I talk with folks about folklore. Do you think that part of the danger of writing down folklore stories is that they become cast in this one way for all time? Like, so it's almost like, okay, this is now set in resin. This is how this is forever and always.
I think yes and no. So, for example, I look at the stories written in the manuscripts and then I go, well, I'm not telling it like that because that's perpetuating a narrative that I don't agree with, which often is a very patriarchal one. So I'm going to tell it from, because stories are organic. So, but I write my stories down because I don't want to forget them. But I never tell the story the same way. I mean, you'll recognize it's the same story, but I'll add details based on who my audience is, or if there's a current situation that might link in. So I think if you can look at manuscripts as a scaffold for your stories, and from which you can build stories relevant for these times, because remember, we need mythology all the time. We need our stories, and we need to be able to utilize them in a way that has a relevance for these times. Like our Druidry within the order, it's not based on ancient practices because we don't know what our ancestors did. However, it's an organic growing. It has links back to the past, but we don't know exactly. But it makes sense for these times. For example, the Wheel of the Year. That's not ancient, that's modern. That was created, by Gerald Gardner, the father of modern Wicca. And he was friendly with Ross Nichols, who founded the OBOD. So between the two of them, but what it is a beautiful synthesis between the four, we say, Celtic festivals, Imbolc, Bealtaine, Lunasa, and Samhain. Now, Imbolc is not mentioned in texts, in the stories. It must be in the text, but not in any of the stories. All of the myths happen either at Bealtaine, Lunasa, and Samhain, but they're the agricultural festivals. And that is what our Celtic ancestors would have followed. And then our pre-Celtic ancestors and speak around the solar festivals, which are expressed in our major monuments. So you have, Newgrange and all of them, big megalithic monuments. So what the Wheel of the Year is a beautiful synthesis of our so-called Celtic ancestors and our pre-Celtic ancestors to make something that's relevant for these modern times. And that's what it is. It's about honoring the past, but it's not stuck, frozen or stuck in aspic. And I think there are Druids and paganists who are reconstructionists, who are adamant this is the way it has to be. That's an impossible task because we don't know. So if you're trying to, some people say, oh no, I want an ancient Irish ritual and I know you can do it. And I go, well, no, mine isn't ancient Irish, but what it is relevant to the landscape in which I am in these times.
Mm-hmm.
If you want that, that's whatever, but I can't tell you what our ancient ancestors did. And again, if you're sticking to the letter of the law, it smacks of fundamentalism, and then nothing grows and nothing develops.
the thing that I like to trot out is Reconstructionism is a methodology, not a religious path. And for me, it's like it gives you some of the keys to understanding, but I'm not a Viking. I'm not an ancient Scandinavian. I am a modern American living in Michigan. And while some of the environmental effects are very similar to where my ancestors came out of, it's certainly not one to one. And the land certainly isn't one to one. So, you know, to me, it's very much a fool's errand of like, we're going to do a strict Reconstructionist and it's only going to be in this way, that way. And when you start really picking apart how many speculative assumptions have to be built to make this cake, you really start to realize quickly, like there's no way to completely 100% accurately reconstruct anything. At some point, you are going to have to make some leaps in logic and some speculation and just pray the gods are okay with it. Like,
And of course, intention is everything.
mhm.
I mean, I wonder what the gods would think of Vikings, you know, the series, and you know, what about the hairdos and I mean, it's spectacular.
I enjoy the series, but I enjoy it for what it is.
Is it an accurate reflection? I don't know if you saw the series Norseman.
I laughed so
I thought it was
hard at that.
his take. I loved it. I just
It's more accurate than Vikings is, which is hilarious to me.
yeah, I loved it. I really did. So it's how do we know? But it's about being able to. I mean, I'm fascinated to know how our ancestors were. So if I'm in
Right.
places like, I wonder what this was fused for, and how would I visualize how they were? And it would be lovely to get, you know, to open a doorway and just to get a clear vision, because it's really fascinating. But even then, I mean, I know how our ancestors made fire. To hell, I'm using a match. I mean, I do have a metal fire stick, but you know, I still cook on a gas cooker, and I'm happy to use an electric kettle if I need it. You know, it's I can't live like our ancestors did. I do love camping and I like cooking over a fire, but I don't do that all of the time.
Right.
So it's about, you know, honoring the past and taking what is really, really useful and relevant for now, and then growing our spiritual path. Otherwise, we'll end up with fundamentalism, and that's not a good thing.
I remember going to the is it the National Heritage Centre down in Waterford?
Is that the
Thank
one,
you.
Brown Oaks, and you've got
Mm,
Castle? Yeah.
yeah, and sort of walking around there, and they'd sort of built sort of houses and villages and things, different eras throughout Irish history. And walking around, and you hear tourists going, "Oh, wouldn't it be great to have lived that many centuries ago in a house like that?" And I'm sort of sitting there and I'm thinking, well, on the one hand, all those stories and things would be very vibrantly told at the time and would feel very contemporary and be commonly known. On the other hand, I quite like my internet and my medication.
Right.
Yes.
And they're not like living in these things, because if they did, they'd realize how damn cold most of them are.
That's right. And it's the smoke. I mean, if you live in a Cronog or something like that, and you've got a central fire, and the smoke hole is up there. I go camping, sitting around smoke fires, and we light fires for our ceremonies. And, you know, there are times when the fire chases you, no matter where you move around the fire, and how challenging that is. And just think about living with that 24/7, because you need to have a fire lighting all the time to keep warm, etc., etc. Yeah.
They're missing all the. This is one of the things I loved about the BBC Farm series, because they actually had these folks living in
Yes.
each of those periods. And one of the things that kept me back to is, this is really hard. You people have no idea.
Yeah.
Poor Ruth would be waking up cold and like, well, I got to get the fire going, or I'm gonna stay cold.
That's right. Yeah.
I think one thing I appreciate a lot that you've mentioned and that I've seen from OBOD is that talking about making things relevant to when and where people are living. And I think that's sort of also connects to what you were saying about the sort of the local spirits and the approaches to local spirits, where people are and where people are from, and also what we were saying about the Irish folklore collection and how it very much ties the myths and legends to different places, and the different folklore tales are very regionalized and stuff. And I think that maybe goes a long way to combating a lot of those ideas of a very romanticized past, and also accepting where people are in the world rather than where they wish they were or where their predecessors were or whatever. I don't know if you had sort of further thoughts on that.
I know from, we'll say, our American members, you know, for many feel huge pain. Them, you know, I had my herbal teacher. She's American, now living in Ireland, and an Irish citizen of Irish Scots origin. She went to a Native American teacher and said, "I want to study with you." And the woman said, "No, you have to go to your own people. You have to go to your own culture." And she said, "But that's many generations." And she says, "I don't care. You need to do that." But she did come. Not everybody can do that. And so if you can't do that, or you come here and you go, "Okay, I've Irish ancestry, but I don't feel Irish. I'm American and stand out like an American," that can be really, really painful. Well, you're like, where do I belong? Where can I stand? And I think no matter where you are, even if it's temporary, you need to be able to find your feet and to stand on the land where, even if it's for a short time, to go and connect with the land and belong there for that length of time. Otherwise, you're always lost. There's always a longing. And I don't have that, because I am so fortunate to, I say I'm Irish, I'm very Irish, but there's lots of Irish cultural things that I don't get and don't understand and don't engage in. So if it was a bell curve, I'm on the edge, but I belong to the land, not necessarily to the cultural practices that happen here, but I belong here. So I don't have that pain that others do. And all I can say is stand where you are and put down roots and stop apologizing for your ancestors. People moved from one place to another out of necessity. You know, we all migrated out of Africa because I imagine populations got bigger, or the climate wasn't so favorable, and we moved. And the people moved from Europe to the US for all sorts of reasons. Usually, I mean, who the hell leaves? If your life is so good where you are, why would you leave? So, I mean, now in modern worlds, we can go, "Oh, I'd like a job in New York and I'm going," and it's a proactive choice rather than I am leaving poverty or violence or oppression. But many of our, ancestors of those living in America left because of poverty, famine, oppression, domination, war, whatever it is. And to be carrying that guilt, that has to stop, because guilt is not helping, but somehow connecting with the spirit of the land, because you're not responsible for your ancestors. At the same time, acknowledging that you're on land that's occupied. I don't have an answer, because I'm living on occupied land. I come from Norman stock, but we don't know who's Irish anyway. But they said the Normans became more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Normans, when they came, they adopted Irish ways. The English never did. So they've never been forgiven. And because of that, where the Normans were. So it's a hard one. I mean, our land was occupied. So it's a hard one. I don't have an answer, but somehow to make some kind of peace of where you are. Otherwise, you're tormented through your life and you pass that on to the next generation. But I don't know how that lies with people whose land has been taken. You say it's all very well for me to say that. But I know my ancestors were moved from their land, but that's so far gone, I don't know where they were. And that's on my mother's side. So I think there's connection with the land and then connection with people. There's two different things.
Yes. Yes, that very much hits right there. Yeah, I agree.
And Indigenous peoples, wherever they are, are very much embedded and entwined with their landscape. Generally modern people don't. It's, they have a nice garden and a nice house in a nice city. I don't know how many actually connect with the spirit of that city and that place and that garden. And I think that's what people need to do, connecting with the actual landscape in a real way, rather than in an appropriative or a proprietorial way.
I think it's also something where, I mean, as you were saying, without sort of guilt or any fault of our own, being in and from Northern or Western Europe, we're going to have a very different view on this to the people in the Americas or in Oceania or in South Africa or anywhere else.
That's right, absolutely. But there still needs to be some kind of connection with the land.
Absolutely. I can't undo the centuries of oppression that white people visited on the native peoples before I got here ancestrally. What I can do is encourage local indigenous sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty broadly speaking. There's so much that folks can do if they don't let their guilt get in the way.
Yeah.
And I think that it's also, speaking as a North American, especially here in the US, I think that's something that at some point, anybody who's got a good heart, who looks honestly at the situation around them, yeah, okay, feel your guilt if you've got guilt. But the problem is when that becomes the stopgap from doing something useful with it. Because guilt and shame are very useful social control tools, but they're not going to help get justice for the native people. And they're not going to help bring sovereignty back into their hands that they by all rights should have. So to my mind, putting that guilt and shame on a pyre and using that as fuel to motivate you, that to me is the goal. Like, get rid of it, make it useful.
I think that's the purpose of guilt and shame anyway. It gets you to do something different. And I think it's about stepping beyond that. And yes, like you say, use it.
And I think that for anybody that is feeling, oh, I can't connect with this land, my ancestors aren't from here. Okay, but you are. And you have the choice to set down roots.
Yeah.
And you can do that in a respectful way where you're a good guest, however you got here, or not. And that, the choice is in your hands. However your ancestors got here is how they got here, but you make the choice in how you set your roots on the earth.
That's right. And the only one who can do it is you.
I understand that frustration, that feeling of almost listlessness when you look at the rich cultural heritage, like in the case of my German and Dutch ancestors, nothing has survived that they could have passed on to me. A couple of words, that's it. None of the stories, none of the folklore, nothing. Like I said, by the time my great grandpa, who was the one that immigrated over here, died, he was living in an era where you did not speak the language because of the anti-German, anti-Dutch sentiment, which was, they all got lumped together, unfortunately. So he lost so much and didn't pass on so much because it was just safer not to, which isn't, talk about assimilation being deadly to culture. That's one example that I can talk about from my heritage is none of the stories got passed down. I had to go look up old folklore through other channels in order to find any of that stuff. I'm sorry, please go ahead, Emily. I did not mean to speak over you.
No, you're fine. I was waiting until you were done. I was just going to mention that I've been living in Southeast Michigan for a couple years. Before that, I lived in Oklahoma for about 4 years. And while I was there, I was looking for a group of pagans to hang out with and practice with. and I met up with the Circle of the Woodland Grove, which is an OBOD grove or around Oklahoma City. And I found it fascinating how they were connecting with the local spirits and creating their own mythology around those spirits, so as to not appropriate anything, but also convey what they were experiencing as current residents of that land, as currently interacting with those spirits. And that showed me how beautiful it is to have a living mythology and something that you're actively engaging with wherever you are. Now, I really like how you talk about rooting into the land and finding that balance and centering, even if you don't necessarily fully root in with the people and the culture of where you are. And I think that is a helpful way to find that internal balance wherever you are. I am curious because you became the Chosen Chief of OBOD, I believe, during COVID or right before. So how has that affected your role as chief, just being in an organization and then having COVID? And did you guys add on a bunch more online things? Or I'm just curious if becoming the chosen chief during that time, how that affected things for you.
Yeah. I became chosen chief in June 2020. And we had planned a big gathering in Glastonbury and a big installation ceremony, etc. Of course, that never happened. And what was really interesting, Dave, our Pendragon, he choreographed or curated an online installation ceremony. So we were recording pieces, parts of it, back and forth. So that we had this online ceremony. It was pre-recorded. I didn't hear it until it happened. And as Druids, one of the first things you learn to do is focus on your own inner grove and develop it. So you have an inner world, and that you are able to occupy that inner world and develop it and grow it. So this was actually our inner grove in action. So I was in my sitting room with my children and some friends, and it went live, and I'm listening to everything and hearing my own voice because it was pre-recorded, and there's Stephanie and there's Philip, and Philip handing me the mantle, and I could feel it. It because we do this on the inner plane or the astral plane, and I could feel it. It was really powerful. And one of my friends who was in the room with me said, I know nothing about this. He said, but I was there. I could see it all happening. This was amazing. So it was an incredibly powerful experience for me, a very moving one. And I thought, this was the way it was meant to happen. Had I been physically in Glastonbury, maybe I'd have been distracted by the 600 people that would have been there. So now I had already been doing some ceremonies for my own grove online on Zoom, for a few months before that. But I was blown away at the power of that online one. Prior to COVID, I'd have said, no way, that trivializes ceremony. You can't be doing this. It's no. And now, so then because that worked, somebody said, would you not continue? Then we started doing it at the solstice, and then we started every 6 weeks. And the rate of people joining during COVID doubled. I'd like to think it was because I took over, but it's not. It's, it was COVID, climate anxiety, whatever. More and more people rapidly joining. And that somehow our online connection has, and people will tell us that it's a lifeline, particularly for people in America or Canada, for whom, live 10 hours drive away from another Druid, or they're living in a part of the US they can't come out to their family or their work. I mean, we've one member who is a teacher, a primary teacher. She cannot use the expression Mother Nature in her school because parents would object or she could be fired. I mean, that to me is crazy. However, so I have my grove in Ireland, and prior to COVID, I was, going over 4 times a year to the UK, going to retreats, meetings, gatherings, tight-knit community. This is what OBOD was for me. And then to discover, oh my God, no, we have so many solitary members all over the world who don't know anybody else. And our online have solved that people say, this is my first ritual I've been at. This is amazing. We have, breakout rooms, chat rooms, people making friends online. So thanks to COVID, I mean, there's probably one good thing about it, is the advancement in all of these platforms that we are now in the last 4 years. So much of our interactions and the fact that we can have a meeting like this is just amazing. And we every 6 weeks have a ceremony, and then we now have a private hub for members where, we have a mental health group, we have a listening circle, we have a death cafe. All of this is where people from all over the world, members, can join. And that's been huge, absolutely huge. And I could never have foreseen that. So when it was announced that I was taking over, people were asking me, what are you going to change and what are you going to do? I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to change, because I think it's fine as it is. I didn't take over the leadership of a sick organization. It worked. It was I belonged there and I loved it. I didn't need to change anything. And then circumstances added things. So our online capability has our membership has grown hugely, but our community is smaller, as in that sense of community is more tight-knit, that people have a greater sense of community despite the increase in numbers.
One thing I'm curious about with OBOD, so I mean, he came up earlier, across pagandom, people are aware of Gerald Gardner to some degree or another. But it seems from where I am, fewer people have heard of Ross Nichols comparatively to Gerald Gardner. How does Druidry as you see it, and how does OBOD view Ross Nichols?
Well, he's the founder of OBOD, so we all know about him. And he was Philip's teacher. Philip was my predecessor. So Philip met him when he was 11, but he started studying with him when he was 15. And then Ross initiated Philip into the order when he was 18. So we all know, because we work with his writings and the teachings that we have. A lot of them are Ross's. So very much there. I suppose Gerald Gardner, interesting character. I mean, he and Ross were friends, and they say Ross did a lot of his writings, wrote a lot of his stuff for him. They were very good friends, but they just had different ways of practicing their spiritual lives, and yet they were friends. So we all know who Ross is. Maybe not on the outside, but within the order, certainly. He's not an unknown figure. And right through the teachings, there'll be pieces of him, quotations, some of his poetry, etc., is there.
I've often I don't know whether you'd agree or disagree, but I've often kind of thought of it as Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols are a bit like the kind of pagan equivalent to a kind of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, in that people look at it and say friends, rivals, borrowing ideas, swapping ideas, things like that, and then diverging, and you get people who follow one more than the other, and maybe are really into one and have barely heard of the other. I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that sort of comparison.
Yeah, I mean, they were friends. They never fought out. They weren't rivals. Maybe, but they were very, very different characters. Just different expressions. It's a bit like, I like tea and you like coffee, but we still take a beverage. they didn't fight. Now, whether the successor or the followers do, that's another thing. And often, you know, when people get so firmly wed to a particular worldview, that any other worldview is wrong. Within the order, we don't care. So we have many of our members are Wiccans or members of other Druid orders, and there's no problem with it. Now, the other orders might have problems with that, with us, but we don't have a problem with them. It's just that, you know, there's enough room for everybody and enough room for any view, for all views. I mean, obviously within reason, we're not talking about abuse, but, you know, just differences of how we see the world and relate to the world. They're all fine.
Mhm.
So, because I'm kind of mindful of the time and mindful that it's very late for us here. I was wondering if you could sort of touch on how your psychological studies and being a psychologist has maybe informed your Druidry, if at all.
Well, much of the training is because Philip, my predecessor, is a psychologist, so a lot of the teachings. So it's a spiritual path, a spiritual development path, but it's also a personal development path. So there are threads, you know, based in psychology right through the teachings. Some who are not members of the order or would criticize us for being too psychological. I don't know how you can ever criticize anyone for being too psychological. I'm not biased, of course. So it's all interwoven. I mean, psychology is about psyche, is about the spirit or the soul, and Druidry you know, is also about the spirit and the soul, and so much more. I think in some ways, I find it hard to separate the two. They're not the same, but they're not separate. Does that make sense? Like we have a mental health group we formed during the year for mental health practitioners who are Druids and who are interested in weaving the two. So when I was studying my psychology, I was, you know, doing my master's, my professional qualification, we were told you don't deal with spirituality. You're psychologists, you leave the spiritual bit to the priests, and you stick to the psychological. I don't know how you can separate the two, but I found clients were coming to me wanting to, you know, work on spiritual issues. So I did. And I mean, with some I do rituals or we go to the woods and things like that, connecting with nature. And, you know, the benefits of being in nature have such a wonderful psychological impact. And now it's really interesting. Psychology, which likes to consider itself to be very, very scientific. Research has been done that shows that, you know, it's beneficial to be in the woods. And it's like, now we can do it because we've had, you know, the endorsement of science or some kind of research. And it's like, huh, you know, we've known this since day one. Anyone knows that sitting under a tree or walking around a tree or being in nature is actually good for you. I think they're very, very much interwoven. So my psychology has given me a confidence to be a Druid, and then Druidry just has allowed me to have a confidence around my nature connection with how I work and my clients, working shamanically with clients, all of that. It's kind of bringing them all together rather than separating them. That really bringing that mind, body, spirit has been really, really helpful. I don't know. Question.
When I went and studied psychology back, and I finished my degree for a bachelor's in psych in 2012. One of the things that was really interesting at the time was how eco-psychology had become a thing, like the previous decade or so, and it was one of the things that I enjoyed studying. What I found really funny was how many of the theories around eco-psych were starting to be proved on these more rigorous t-tests that the strict behaviorists would accept as being scientific enough. And now we're coming around to where it's full circle where, oh, well, it turns out that, the strict behaviorists, might have introduced strict scientific measures into the curriculum, but we're not sure if that's actually had the knock-on effect that we were hoping it would. And with the rise of like especially transpersonal psychology and like getting away from the strict behaviorists as a movement, I think has been really healthy because it's made it so that there was a period in time where I think psychology was embarrassed by its own history and embarrassed by the squishy nature that is psychology. And you're not the only psychologist that I've spoken with where, especially because of the universities that I was around. So I went to Eastern Michigan University, and U of M is like right there. And so like a lot of the big talking heads of psychology in our circles were either really married to behaviorism, or the more trendy ones were starting to go towards transpersonal and ecopsych, which was gratifying as a pagan and a heathen to see, because it really took some of the strict, well, you can't talk about religion because only the religious people will talk about that, and you're just like the same exact attitudes that you're talking about I could hear in some of my older professors, and then in a lot of my younger ones it was like a clear rejection of the old order of, we're going to just hive everything off and nothing is going to relate to anything else. It's good to see on the one hand where, okay, we're admitting this is a squishier science than what the strict behaviorist predecessors wanted to turn it into, because it's not like I'll apply this much medication and you'll be free of all the ills that have to do with these diagnoses. Like this is where I think that a lot of modern psychology is starting to reorient itself, and it's good to see and good to hear.
Oh, absolutely. It needs to cop itself on. Yes.
Especially because like psychology is it's not just squishy, but it's so individual. And when you're talking like, especially here in the States, everybody wants to like trot up the DSM-5 like it's the gold standard of psychology, and it's like, guys, this is just how we get paid. Like, this is not like what you're learning versus what the DSM says can sometimes be two different things.
And DSM, has pathologized so much like grief, and you go, this is in the DSM. It's like, no, that's normal.
Right?
Yeah.
Sorry. It's one of my hyper foci. It's one of those things where I appreciate that it's a soft science, in part because I really suck at math, but also just appreciate it for its own sake.
Well, soft science shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. I mean, hard science, maybe
Yeah.
hard science. I think it's there's a lot of art in psychology, and I think that is huge value.
I think back to the old, I believe they were Roman and Greek before them, incubation rooms where you would go for a time and you would sleep in the temple and you would get a dream, or you'd get some kind of feeling of healing, or you'd get whatever disease it was would go away. And you'd leave like a plaster cast of something behind as an offering to Asclepius, that kind of thing. And I think that almost in miniature, I went to therapy a couple of years ago, and it was very healing for me. And one of the things that she didn't do was say, well, we're not going to talk spirituality. She said, oh, you're an animist and a polytheist? Cool. Here's a deck of animal cards. We're going to let them direct the session, and we'll see where we go with this.
Now that's really interesting.
And so
really, that's beautiful.
It was an honoring of my path while still being very much about the therapy session. And I think one of the things I'm hoping as we go forward is that psychology and social work adopts a more incubatory system where you may or may not be, healed when you walk out of this mini temple of healing, after this hour-long session, but you're on your way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, using cards and things like that, it's not woo-woo. It's actually, it could be a point for discussion.
Yeah.
It can be a guide. It's just a tool that you can use that can be very, very revealing. Can speak, and I'm always amazed at the magic and the synchronicity of these things. Reading with cards, and you're going to go, my God, that just fits so much with what's going on in my life, and I've experienced it too often and too many times to dismiss it.
So, just to kind of ask a sort of final question as we head towards sort of wrapping up here, on a sort of maybe daily, weekly basis, what does your personal practice, if you have one, look like? And what does a druid look like for you on a sort of day-to-day basis?
Okay, I suppose we all have our own different practice, but I mean, when I wake up, I have to I'm not a morning person, so I wake up reluctantly when the alarm goes off, and I'm very fond of my snooze button. So while I'm snoozing for 10 minutes, this is where, I focus on prayers of surrender, protection, handing myself over. I say a Druid's prayer for peace. And it's about preparing myself before I get out of the bed for the day. And I'll do a little bit of yoga small. And then, I always light a candle. I have an altar. I open up the 4 quarters. I create space. And so if I'm working with clients, I do that the same. So it's mindful of creating a sacred, I mean, all space is sacred, but just that being a bit more, bringing it to my awareness rather than making it sacred. It's already, but bringing it to my own awareness. I live in a rural area. I have trees and plants all around me. So I just have to look out my window if I'm having a shower. I have clear glass and I can look out into my garden. Again, honoring what I see and recognizing, what I see at different times of the year, just being aware of the season and just tuning into nature. So it's about being aware of that. I'm practicing gratitude for I am just so lucky where I live. There's nobody bombing my house. I'm secure. I'm actually living in a country that's now safe to be a woman. Well, most of the time. And to be a Druid, I grew up in a very oppressive Ireland. It's not like that anymore. I've never had to hide what I do. I taught in a seminary for 27 years. Everybody knew I was a priestess in the Fellowship of Isis. I'm a Druid. I never had to hide it. So I'm very, very lucky to be living where I am at the moment. I'm very, very grateful to be allowed practice to be a Druid.
So, Gurev Mila Mila Margot. If people want to find out more about you or about OBOD, where can we direct people to?
Well, my website is kilkennydruidry.com and OBOD is druidry.org. And on that website, you could find lots and lots of information about Druidry. There's an introductory course you can sign up to, see if it's for you or not. Lots and lots of information. Yeah. And I'm on Instagram, Eimear Burke, Druid Shanachie. I think that's the name.
Thank you. We'll make sure we get all those links in the episode description for people listening, wherever they happen to be listening. And Gurev Mila Mila Margot, I really appreciate you taking the time out and staying so late talking to us.
Well, Fulcherod, agus Jas Kosaliv, one may alone salt as an Gorasha. Thank you. It was lovely to meet you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. And I'm just so impressed with your Irish. So I'm really, really impressed and delighted.
I really appreciate you spending so much time with us. As always, thank you to all of our listeners. Before we go, we're going to plug our pluggables because I almost forgot to do that. Well, you can find us on patreon.com/aroundgrandfatherfire. If you wish to join our Discord, you do not need to be a member of the Patreon. We greatly appreciate if you sign up for the Patreon, but you don't have to be a member to be a Discord member. Our Discord is always open, so please join if you wish. It's always bopping at some point with somebody bringing something forward they want to talk about. And I really appreciate the community we've managed to grow and sustain through all these years. And Snow, please plug your pluggables.
You can find me at Snow the Goth on all the things. You can find my writing at snowthegoth.com. Linktree/Snow the Goth will take you to my social media stuff and my music and everything else. What about you, Emily?
You can find my occasionally updated blog at streakingfate.wordpress.com.
And you can find our wonderful Cabra at thesteelcitywitch.com. And you can also find their content on YouTube. Highly recommend. I love their videos. You can also find myself at patreon.com/Sarenth Odinson. You can commission me to write on a topic, or you can commission me to write on a prayer. Pretty much any spirit or God you wish. And you can also find my work at sarenth.wordpress.com. And I'm on most social media as Sarenth, Sarenth. And I want to really thank everybody for showing up and for listening